Most mornings, Diane Hartley woke up and didn't know what she was
Okay.
supposed to do with the day. Her husband had been gone 4 months. Her daughter called every few days with a voice full of worry that Diane didn't know how to answer. She had $200 no plan and a heart that felt like a room someone had moved out of. On a Tuesday in February, she almost
Oh,
drove past
God.
a dusty bakery window on Main
Are you
Street.
okay?
Almost. Inside, through the filmed glass empty shelves, a counter gone gray with dust, and on the kitchen shelf, a green tin box. Old. Rust on the corners, sitting there like it belonged to no one. It had been sitting there for 3 years. She went in. The landlord told her pleasantly, almost kindly, that women like her didn't usually make it in a place like this. She signed the lease anyway. And 3 weeks later, when she opened that tin box and read what was written on the bottom, she understood that Eleanor Price had not left it there by accident. She had left it there for her. 3 months after she buried Tom, Diane Hartley was still making coffee for 2 people every morning. Not on purpose. She never decided to. Her hands just did it the way hands do things they've done 10,000 times without being asked. 2 scoops. 2 cups set out on the counter. The coffee maker running. The kitchen filling with that smell. Then she would turn around and see them both sitting there, and she would stand still for a moment, just a moment, before picking one up and putting it back in the cabinet. She did this for 11 weeks before she noticed she was doing it. Tom had been gone since October. Heart attack, the doctor said. 54 years old, sitting in his chair after dinner, and then he was just gone. No warning. No goodbye. The television was still on when she found him. The weatherman was talking about a cold front coming in from the north. She had turned the TV off. She had called 911. She had done everything the way you do things when your body keeps moving because it doesn't know yet what your mind already knows. 24 years. That was how long they had been married. Long enough that she had stopped thinking of herself as a separate person who had chosen him. She was just them, the two of them. The way a house stops being a building at some point and just becomes home, and you don't notice the change until the day you're standing in it alone and it feels like a place you've never been. She was not dramatic about her grief. She didn't fall apart. She got up every morning, she made the coffee, she did the laundry. She drove to the grocery store. She talked to the neighbors when she saw them in the driveway. She was fine in the way that fine means I am still standing, and I would rather not talk about what that costs. What she didn't have was any sense of forward, any sense of what came next or why it would matter, or who she was now that the person she had organized her life around for 24 years was gone. Her daughter called on a Wednesday morning, the third call that week. Melissa was 26 and lived in Atlanta and had her father's way of getting to the point which Diane usually appreciated. Right now, it was a lot. Mom, are you eating? Yes. Real food, not just crackers and coffee. I made soup last night. A short silence. Then, Mom, I really think you should come stay with me. Even just for a few weeks. You shouldn't be in that house by yourself. Diane looked out the kitchen window. The yard was brown and bare. Tom had always done the yard in November, raking the last of the leaves before the cold set in for good. The leaves were still out there. She hadn't raked them. I'm okay here, she said. You're not okay. You're just managing. That was true. Diane didn't argue it. Come to Atlanta, Melissa said. I have the space. We could... Melissa. What? I appreciate it. I do. But I don't need Atlanta. She paused. I don't know what I need. But it's not that. Another silence, longer this time. She could hear Melissa breathing that particular breath that meant she was trying to find the version of what she wanted to say that wouldn't start a fight. Then what are you going to do? Melissa asked. Not unkind, just tired of waiting for an answer that hadn't come yet. Diane didn't have one. She held the phone and looked at the 1 cup of coffee on the counter and did not say anything. "I don't know yet," she said finally. "Okay," Melissa said. "Okay. I love you." "I love you too." She hung up and sat with her coffee in the quiet kitchen and thought about what Melissa had asked. "What are you going to do?" As if there was a list somewhere. As if grief came with a timeline and a checklist and a clear set of next steps. As if the answer was just a matter of thinking hard enough. She had been an office administrator for 19 years. She was good at lists, good at knowing what came next. She had managed other people's chaos for 2 decades and made it look simple. She had no idea what came next for herself. That was the truth of it. She rinsed her cup. She got her coat. She had coffee filters to buy. It was a Tuesday in February. Cold but dry, the sky, the flat white of winter in Georgia. She drove down Maple, turned on Birch, and was 2 blocks from the pharmacy when she came around the corner onto Main Street and saw it. She had driven down Main Street 100 times, maybe more. She knew every storefront, the hardware store, the insurance office, the diner with the hand-painted sign. She had never paid particular attention to the bakery on the corner, or rather what used to be a bakery. The window was dark. The glass was filmed with the particular gray of long undisturbed dust. The old gold lettering had faded to almost nothing. Price's Bakery. You could still read the P and the B if you knew to look. She didn't mean to slow down. She didn't mean to pull over. But her foot found the brake before her mind made any decision, and then she was just sitting there, engine running, looking at that window. She didn't know what she was looking at. Just a closed storefront. Just a building that used to be something and wasn't anymore. But she sat there. She pressed her face against the glass, hands cupped around her eyes the way she hadn't done since she was a girl, looking into a toy store window after closing time. Inside, the shape of a counter. Bare shelves. A kitchen through the pass-through, dark and still. And on the shelf above the old range, sitting alone in the dim, a green tin box. Old. Rust at the corners. She straightened up. Looked at the for rent sign, sun-bleached and slightly crooked. Took a picture of the phone number with her phone. Stood on that sidewalk for a long moment. She didn't go in. The door was locked. She didn't have a key and no reason to have one. But she didn't walk away either. She stood there long enough that a woman walking a dog glanced at her and looked away. She stood there long enough to feel the cold coming through her coat. She stood there and looked at that dusty window and that dark room and that small tin box on the shelf, and something in her chest, not hope exactly, telling that certain shifted. Just slightly. The way something shifts when it's been still too long and finally moves. She didn't know why she stopped. She just stopped. And sometimes, though, she wouldn't understand this until much later. That's the whole thing. That's all it takes. You stop, you look, you don't walk away. Everything else comes after. The next morning, Diane went back. She didn't tell Melissa. She didn't tell anyone. She had called the number on the sign the night before, sitting at the kitchen table after dinner with the phone in her hand, and the number already dialed before she had fully decided to do it. A man answered on the second ring. Garrett Hollis. He said he could meet her at 9. She was there at 8:55. He arrived at 9 exactly, which told her something. A man who arrives exactly on time is a man who has decided before he walks in the door how much of himself this meeting deserves. He was 58, broad-shouldered, in a gray sport coat and dress shoes that were slightly too polished for a Tuesday morning showing of an empty storefront. He had the handshake of someone who had been shaking hands professionally for 30 years, firm, brief, already moving on. He looked at her the way some people read a price tag. Quick, complete, done. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, "have you run a business before? Not nice to meet you. Not let me show you around." Straight to the question, in a tone that made clear it wasn't really a question. "No," Diane said. He nodded the way people nod when you confirm what they already knew. Then he unlocked the door. The bell above the frame didn't ring so much as scrape a dragging, reluctant sound, like something that had been silent for 3 years and wasn't sure it remembered how. Diane stepped inside. The floor was pine old and dark with decades of use, and it gave slightly under her feet, not unstable, just lived in the way old floors carry the weight of everyone who has ever stood on them. The air hit her before she had taken 3 steps. Butter burnt long ago and dust, and underneath both of those something else, something faint and warm that she couldn't name. Not quite bread. The memory of bread, maybe. The idea of a kitchen that had once been full. She stopped in the middle of the room and looked around slowly. The marble counter ran the length of the left wall, cracked at the far end but solid. The shelves behind it were empty, the wood darker where things had once sat on them for years. The ceiling was pressed tin, painted white once, now the color of old paper. 2 windows faced the street, their glass filmed with the gray of undisturbed dust, the light coming through them thick and diffused the way light looks underwater. And through the pass-through window to the kitchen, the shelf above the old range, the tin box. Green rust at the corner's lid pressed shut, sitting exactly where it had been when she'd pressed her face against the glass the day before. She looked at it. She didn't move toward it. Garrett was talking. Square footage. Zoning classification. The age of the range, which he said had been serviced 2 years ago, though he said it in the tone of a man who was not entirely sure that was true. Diane listened with part of her attention and kept the other part on the room, on the particular quality of the quiet in it, on the way the space felt neither abandoned nor empty, but more like paused, like something that had been in the middle of happening and then stopped, and was waiting without impatience to begin again. He walked her through the lease terms at the counter, spreading the papers out on the marble. The rent was higher than she'd expected. She'd looked up comparable spaces the night before, and this was 30% above what the numbers said it should be. She noted this and said nothing. The contract was 6 months. There was a minimum revenue clause, a specific monthly figure that, if not met, gave him the right to terminate early. She read the clause twice. It was not a small number. "That's a fairly high bar for a new business," she said. "It's standard for this location," he said in the tone of someone who has decided something is standard and does not expect to be asked about it again. She looked at the clause. She looked at the figure. She thought about the $200 in her wallet and the checking account that was adequate but not generous, and the complete absence of any business plan or prior experience or sensible reason to be standing here at all. Then Garrett gathered the papers into a neat stack, and he turned to look at the room one more time. The slow, assessing look of a man cataloging an asset, and he said almost to himself in the pleasant tone of someone stating a simple fact. 3 tenants before you. None of them made it past the first contract." He paused, then added, "I don't expect this one to be different." He wasn't being cruel. That was the thing that stayed with her afterward. He wasn't trying to wound her. He simply believed it the way you believe that it will rain when the sky looks a certain way. He had looked at her and reached his conclusion, and was now in his own way being honest about it. Diane picked up the pen. She signed her name on the line at the bottom of the contract, and then on the 2 pages after it, and then she put the pen down on the marble counter and slid the papers back across to him. Garrett looked at the signature, then at her. Something moved across his face, not quite surprise, more like the brief recalibration of a man whose estimate has just been complicated by new data. He picked up the papers, folded them, put them in his jacket pocket. "I'll have the formal copies to you by end of week," he said, "along with the keys." He left the way he'd come, efficiently, without ceremony. The bell above the door made its scraping sound. Then the room was quiet. Diane stood at the counter alone. She stood there for a while, without moving, listening to the street outside come in thin and muffled through the dusty windows. A car passing. Someone's radio. The ordinary sounds of a Tuesday morning in a small Georgia town filtered through 3 years of closed doors. Then she walked into the kitchen. She stood in front of the shelf and looked at the tin box for a moment. Then she reached up and lifted it down. It was heavier than it looked. Not dramatically, just solid, the weight of something that was full of something. She tried the lid with her thumb. It didn't move. The metal had swollen into itself, over the years sealed shut the way old things seal themselves when they've been closed long enough. She turned the box over. On the bottom, under a strip of tape so old it had gone brown and brittle at the edges, there was writing. Ink faded to the color of weak tea, but still legible if you held it in the light coming through the kitchen window. 4 words. For the one who stays. Diane read them again. She didn't know what they meant. She didn't know who had written them or when or why they had put the words on the bottom rather than the top, as if they weren't meant for someone who picked the box up out of curiosity, but for someone who had already turned it over. Someone who had already decided to look more closely. She put the box in her bag. She walked out of the bakery, locked the door with the key Garrett had left on the counter, and went to her car. She sat in the driver's seat and did not start the engine for a moment. The box was in her bag on the passenger seat. She didn't look at it, but she was aware of it the whole way home. It sat in her bag the whole drive back, heavier than she expected. Heavier, she thought, than 4 words on the bottom of an old tin box had any right to be. It took 3 days, half a can of WD-40, and a small hammer she found in the kitchen drawer before the tin box finally opened. Not dramatically. There was no pop, no sudden release. She had worked at the lid every evening after dinner. A little oil, a little pressure, the hammer tapping along the seam to loosen what years had sealed. On the 3rd evening, it simply gave the way things give when you've been patient long enough. A slow yielding, a creak, and then the lid lifting under her thumbs. She set it on the kitchen table and looked at what was inside. The top layer was a sheet of waxed paper folded neatly into quarters. She lifted it. Beneath it were recipe cards, dozens of them filed in 3 small bundles held together with kitchen twine. The kind of thin cotton twine you find in old kitchens in old houses, the kind that has been tied and untied so many times it has gone soft. Each card was handwritten in the same hand, small letters precise leaning slightly to the right. The writing of someone who had learned penmanship when penmanship was taught as a discipline, not a suggestion. The ink on the older cards had faded to pale brown. The newer ones were darker black, going slowly to gray. Eleanor's honey almond cake. Buttermilk biscuits, the real ones. Brown sugar peach pie. The bread I make on Sundays. She set the bundles aside carefully, one at a time, the way you set aside things that belong to someone else. At the bottom of the box, beneath the last bundle, was a notebook. Small, the size of a paperback, with a cover the dark green of old library books. No title on the front. Just a small white label on the spine, handwritten, "For keeping." Diane opened it. She didn't start at the beginning. She did what you do with a book you're not sure about, yet opened it somewhere in the middle to see what she found before deciding whether to go back to the start. The page she opened to was dated September 2009. The mill on Route 9 closed in August, and about 40 families are without work. I've been opening at 5 in the morning now and keeping the lights on until 8 at night. I don't charge the families who can't pay. I keep a separate ledger not because I expect to collect someday, but because it matters to me that I wrote their names down. That I noticed. That they weren't invisible to me just because they were struggling. People keep asking how I'm managing. I've learned that most people don't really want the full answer to that question, so I usually say fine and move on. The real answer is that I'm not managing so much as I'm just doing the next thing. Make the bread. Open the door. Put the coffee on. Do the next thing. I've found that if you do the next thing long enough, you look up one day and realize you've come further than you thought you would. Diane read the entry twice. Then she turned forward toward the back of the notebook. The second passage she found was undated. The ink color placed it somewhere in the mid-90s, she guessed. There was a man I loved, before I knew what loving someone actually requires of you. He left when he understood that I was never going to leave this place, and I don't hold that against him. Some people are made for going, and some are made for staying, and it's only wrong when you try to be the kind you're not. I've made my peace with being the kind that stays. Most days it doesn't feel like I gave anything up. It feels like knowing myself. She read that one 3 times. Then she turned to the last page. The final entry was dated November 2021. The handwriting was the same but slower. Each letter placed with slightly more deliberateness, the careful way writing changes when the hand is no longer certain of itself. I've been thinking about what happens to this place after I'm gone. I have no children. The people I was closest to are mostly gone before me. I could leave the recipes to no one, which means they disappear, or I could try to leave them to the right person, which means trusting that the right person will come. I've decided to trust. I don't know who she'll be. I don't even know for certain it will be a she. But I know what she will have done. She will have stayed when staying wasn't the obvious choice. She will have looked more closely when looking closely wasn't required. She will have picked up the box and turned it over. If you're reading this, that's you. I hope the almond cake gives you trouble at first. It gave me trouble for 2 full years before I got it right. That's how you'll know you're doing it honestly. This town has fed me for 51 years. I hope you'll let it feed you too. Diane closed the notebook. She sat at the kitchen table. Not her kitchen, she'd brought the box to the bakery that morning, wanting to read it there, and she sat in the quiet of the empty room for a while. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past. Someone on the sidewalk said something and laughed. Ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning coming in through the dusty glass. She was still sitting there when the door opened. The woman who came in was 71 years old, and moved like someone who had decided at some point in the past decade that she was done moderating herself for other people's comfort. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee, not from the bakery, from somewhere else, and she set one on the counter in front of Diane without asking whether Diane wanted it. "You're the one who took the lease," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Diane said. "Patsy Webb, hardware store across the street." She looked around the room with the particular attention of someone who had looked at this room many times before and was measuring how it had changed. Then she sat down on the other stool at the counter and wrapped both hands around her cup. "You've been reading Eleanor's things." "Yes." Patsy was quiet for a moment. She looked out the window at the street. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted slightly, not softer exactly, but more deliberate. "Eleanor Price opened this bakery in 1970, she said. She was 22 years old. She had saved 3 years of waitressing money, and she walked into the landlord's office, different landlord, long gone now, and she paid the first 6 months in cash, and she opened the next week." She paused. She never took a loan, never had a partner, never had a bad word to say about anyone who had one, but it wasn't how she did things. "How long did you know her?" 43 years. Patsy said it the way people say numbers that still surprise them. I moved here in 1980. She was the first person to bring something to my door when I arrived. A pie. Blueberry. I didn't even like blueberry pie at the time. She looked down at her coffee. I do now. She told Diane about the recession of 2008. The mill closing the families the ledger Eleanor kept, but never showed anyone. She told her about the ice storm of 2014, when Eleanor had opened the bakery as a warming station for 3 days straight and slept in the back on a folding cot because she didn't want to leave the door unlocked without someone there. She told her that when Eleanor finally closed the bakery in 2022, when her hands had gotten bad enough that she couldn't work the dough, she had come across the street to Patsy's store and stood at the counter and said simply, "I think that's it for me, Patsy." And then she had gone home. When she died that November, Patsy said the town went quiet, not because anyone organized a period of mourning, just because people felt it. You'd walk into a room and there was less in it somehow. She picked up her coffee. I've never known how else to describe it. They sat with that for a moment. Patsy set her cup down and reached for her jacket. Then Diane asked the question she hadn't known she was going to ask until it was already out. Do you know why she left the box here in the bakery instead of taking it with her when she closed? Patsy stopped. She turned back and looked at Diane with the particular attention of someone deciding how much to say. Then she sat back down. Eleanor told me something the week before she went into the hospital, she said. We were sitting right here well at this counter. She said, Patsy, I registered the copyright on all of those recipes back in 1987, every one of them. I had a lawyer draw up the paperwork. It's in the box. I asked her what she meant by that, and she said, whoever finds the box and is running this bakery, they have the legal right to use them. The transfer conditions are all there. The lawyer's son still has the firm 2 blocks down. She looked at Diane steadily. She said she'd thought about giving the recipes to someone specific, Patsy continued. A niece, a friend's daughter. But every time she thought about it, it felt wrong. She said, the right person will come to the bakery, Patsy. I'd rather trust the bakery to find her than try to find her myself. Patsy stood up, put on her jacket, picked up her coffee cup. 3 people rented this space after Eleanor closed it, she said at the door. A woman who wanted to sell antiques. A man who had plans for a sandwich shop. A young couple who were gone before the first month was out. She looked at Diane. You're the first person who's ever asked me about the box. The door closed behind her. The bell made its scraping sound. Then the room was quiet again. Diane sat at the counter and looked at the notebook lying open in front of her. At the last entry, at Eleanor's careful, slowing handwriting. If you're reading this, that's you. 3 tenants before her. Not one of them had asked. The first batch of almond cake burned on the bottom. Not charred, just that flat, bitter smell that starts before the timer goes off. The smell that means you've gotten close, but not right. Diane pulled the pan out, looked at the underside, and scraped it into the trash without saying anything. She washed the pan. She started again. The second batch came out dense in the center. She cut into it with a knife and could see it, that pale, wet layer that meant the heat hadn't reached evenly, or the leavening was off, or something in the ratio she hadn't understood from reading the card. She tasted a piece from the outside edge where it had baked through. It tasted like cake. It was supposed to taste like Eleanor's almond cake, and those were apparently not the same thing. Into the trash. Pan washed. Started again. The third batch had the right color and the right rise. She stood at the oven window and watched it come up and felt something that might have been cautious hope. She pulled it out at exactly the right time. Let it cool the way the card said. Cut a slice. Tasted it. The color was right. The texture was close. But it didn't smell right. It smelled like almond cake. It was supposed to smell like something more than that, like a kitchen that had been making this cake for 50 years, like a place that people remembered before they even walked in the door. It just smelled like cake. She was standing at the counter, looking at the third failed batch, when Patsy came in the way Patsy had taken to coming in mid-morning, with 2 coffees and no particular warning. Patsy looked at the cake. She looked at the recipe card on the counter. She picked it up, read it, set it down. "Did you let the batter rest overnight?" she asked. "The card doesn't say to rest it." "Eleanor never wrote that part down," Patsy said. "She told me once that some things can't be written, they have to be told." She rested every batter overnight in the refrigerator. She said the ingredients needed time to decide to become something together. She looked at the cake on the counter. She said that about most things, not just batter. Diane picked up a pencil and wrote it in the margin of the recipe card, next to the line about folding in the egg whites. "Rest overnight. Ingredients need time to decide." She made the 4th batch the next morning from batter she'd mixed the night before and left in the cold. She could tell before she put it in the oven that something was different, the texture of it, the way it moved in the bowl. It had become something during the night. She didn't know how else to say it. It had spent 8 hours deciding. The cake that came out was not Eleanor's almond cake, but it was beginning to understand what Eleanor's almond cake was trying to be. Melissa called on a Thursday evening. Diane was at the bakery, her hands dusted with flour, the phone balanced between her ear and her shoulder, the way she'd learned to do when her hands were busy. "Mom, what is that sound?" "Bread dough." A silence on Melissa's end. Not a long one, but the kind that has something in it. "You're making bread." "I'm learning to." "At the bakery?" "Yes." Another silence. Then Melissa said in the careful voice she used when she was trying to say something difficult without it becoming an argument. "Mom, you're 51 years old. You've never run a business. You signed a lease on a space that 3 other people already failed in, and now you're learning to bake from recipe cards that belong to a woman you never met." She paused. I want to understand what you're doing, because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're setting yourself up to get hurt." Diane looked out the bakery window at the street. The afternoon light was going long and thin across the sidewalk. "I know how it looks," she said. "Then help me understand it differently." She thought about how to answer that. She thought about Eleanor's journal, about the entry from 2009 about "do the next thing." She thought about the 4th batch of almond cake cooling on the counter, which was not yet right, but was closer than the 3rd. She thought about Patsy's voice saying the ingredients needed time to decide to become something together. "I can't explain it the way you want me to," Diane said finally. "All I can tell you is that this is the first thing in 5 months that I've wanted to keep doing the next morning. And I don't know what that means yet, but I know it's not nothing." Melissa didn't say anything for a moment. "Then, are you eating real food, not just flour and butter?" "Patsy brings soup sometimes." "Who's Patsy?" "A friend," Diane said, and realized as she said it that it was true. She heard Melissa exhale. Not a sigh exactly, something between worry and something that hadn't decided yet what it was. "Call me when the bread is good," Melissa said. "I will." She hung up and stood at the window for a while watching the street. A man walked past with a dog. A woman pushed a stroller. 2 kids on bikes. Ordinary Tuesday evening in Clover Hill, Georgia. She had lived here for 11 years and never noticed before how much life moved through a single block. On the 3rd week, on a Wednesday morning, Diane turned the closed sign to open at 7 o'clock. No announcement. No sign in the window. She had put 2 trays of biscuits and the latest version of the almond cake in the display case and made a pot of coffee and unlocked the door. And that was all. She didn't know if anyone would come. 40 minutes later, the bell above the door made its scraping sound. The man who came in was old late 70s, she guessed, with the careful, deliberate walk of someone who had learned not to hurry. He wore a plaid flannel shirt and a cap with the logo of a farm supply company, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the room the way you look at a place that holds a lot of years for you, like he was checking whether it was still there. His name, she would learn, was Clem. He had been coming to Price's Bakery since 1978. He stood at the display case for a while without speaking. He looked at the biscuits. He looked at the cake. He looked at Diane. "Do you have the almond cake?" "I do." "Eleanor's recipe?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I'll take 3 slices." He paid with exact change. She had the feeling he had been paying with exact change his entire life, and he took the small white bag she handed him and turned toward the door. She thought that was it. She was already turning back to the counter. Then he stopped. He turned around and looked at the cake through the display case glass for a moment. Then he looked at her. "It smells like hers," he said. "Not quite, but close." He thought about it. "You can tell you've been working at it honestly." He left. The bell scraped. The door closed. Diane stood behind the counter holding the money of 5, and some ones worn soft the way money gets when it's been in a wallet a long time. She stood there holding it and didn't move for a while. It was not a compliment. She understood that. Not quite was not a compliment, but she also understood that from Clem, from a man who had been eating Eleanor's almond cake since 1978, close and honestly, were the most useful things anyone had said to her in 5 months. They were not flattery. They were a direction. She put the money in the register. She went back into the kitchen. She started on the next batch. That evening, after she had locked up and cleaned the kitchen and turned off the lights, Diane sat at the counter with Eleanor's journal. She had been reading it in pieces, a few pages at a time, the way you eat something you want to last. She found a page near the back she had skipped over before because it had been stuck to the page behind it, and she hadn't noticed. The ink was darker than the surrounding entries, written with more pressure, the way people write when they're working something out. The entry was dated March 1987. "Sat with a lawyer this afternoon about the recipes. He asked me what I was trying to protect. I told him not the recipes themselves, the right to decide who carries them forward. He said he could draw something up. It took most of the afternoon and cost me 2 weeks of grocery money. But when I left his office, I felt for the first time that I had done something that would outlast me. The paperwork is in the box. The address is on the envelope." Diane set the journal down. She turned the notebook over in her hands the way she had before, slowly. Then she pressed the back cover with her thumb and felt it. A slight give beneath the lining. Not paper, something stiffer. She worked her thumbnail along the edge where the lining met the board. It lifted. Beneath the lining, a slim envelope. White once, now the pale yellow of old paper. Sealed. No name on the front. Just the bakery's address, written in Eleanor's handwriting. 114 Main Street. Diane set it on the counter. She looked at it. Then she got up and filled the kettle and set it on the range and stood with her back to the envelope while the water came to a boil, looking at nothing in particular through the dark kitchen window. When the tea was ready, she poured it, carried it back to the counter, sat down. She picked up the envelope. She put the kettle on before she opened it. Some things deserved that much. Inside the envelope were 2 things. The first was a folded letter, 1 page typed on the letterhead of a law firm called Finch and Associates. She didn't read the legal language carefully, not at first. What she read was the address at the top, 114 Main Street, Clover Hill, and the name Eleanor May Price, and near the bottom, a sentence she read 3 times. The conditions of transfer are fully documented in the firm's permanent files. The recipient is encouraged to contact this office directly. The second was a handwritten note. 1 paragraph, no greeting, no signature. The almond cake is the hardest one. If you've gotten it right by the time you read this, you're further along than I was at your stage. If you haven't, keep going. The secret is the rest. Everything needs rest before it becomes what it's supposed to be. The batter, the bread, the people. Give things the night. See what they become by morning. Diane sat at the counter for a long time after she finished reading. She didn't know exactly what the letter meant, not the legal parts. But she knew the address of Finch and Associates. She had walked past it 100 times. It was 2 blocks away. She put the kettle on before she opened it. Some things deserved that much. The morning after she read the envelope, Diane opened the bakery at 6:30 and didn't tell anyone what she now knew. She made biscuits. She made coffee. She unlocked the door and flipped the sign and waited. By the 6th week, Thursdays had become the busiest morning of the week. By 8 o'clock, there were 4 people at the counter and 2 at the small table by the window. Clem had come in at 7:15, same as he had every Thursday for the past 2 weeks, and was sitting at the end of the counter with his coffee and a biscuit, reading something on his phone with the concentrated expression of a man who had recently learned how to use one and was still deciding how he felt about it. Patsy had stopped in at 7:30. She was standing near the kitchen door with her coffee not in the way, just present the way Patsy was present, which was to say comfortably and without requiring anything. The bell above the door scraped at 8:44. Garrett Hollis walked in. He was in the gray sport coat again. He looked around the room the way he always did, that brief inventory of a space he considered his. He saw the people at the counter. He saw Patsy. He walked to the counter and set a thick envelope down on the marble in front of Diane. Mrs. Hartley. Diane looked at the envelope, then at him. You're 12% below the minimum revenue threshold, he said. The contract allows for a 60-day review. We're past 60 days. He said it the way you read a meter or check a gauge. Factual. Impersonal. I'm exercising the early termination clause. You have 30 days. The room had gone quiet. Not silent, there was still the sound of the coffee maker, still a car outside, but the particular quiet of people who have stopped their own conversations to listen to someone else's. Diane didn't say anything. Garrett looked around the room once more at the cups on the counter, at Clem's biscuit, at the display case with its cakes, and then he said, almost as an addition, the way you mentioned something you almost forgot. I already have a buyer for this space. They'll be putting in a Starbucks. Nobody spoke. Garrett straightened his jacket. He nodded once to no one in particular. He walked to the door and pushed it open, and the bell made its scraping sound, and he was gone. The room stayed quiet for a moment after he left. Then Clem picked up his coffee cup and took a slow sip, and the woman at the small table went back to whatever she'd been doing on her phone, and the ordinary sounds of the morning came back in one by one the way sounds do after something has interrupted them. Patsy caught Diane's eye from across the room. Diane shook her head slightly. Not now. She served the rest of the morning on autopilot. Refilled cups, answered questions about the biscuits, smiled at the right moments, did all the surface things while the 30 days sat in the middle of her chest like a stone she couldn't put down. By 11, the bakery had emptied. Patsy stayed. She sat back down at the counter after the last customer left and wrapped her hands around her cup and said, "Talk." "He's within his rights," Diane said. "I checked the contract again last night. The revenue clause is clear." "I know he's within his rights," Patsy said. That's not what I asked. Diane leaned against the counter behind her and looked at the tin box on the kitchen shelf. She thought about Tom. Not the grief of him, she was past the worst of that, or at least she'd found a way to carry it. She thought about what Tom would say right now standing in this kitchen. Tom, who had always been able to see through the thing she was doing to the thing she was actually doing. He would say, "You already know what to do. You've known for a while. You're just waiting until you're sure enough to admit it." "I need to call my daughter," Diane said. Patsy nodded. She picked up her cup and her jacket and gave Diane the room. Diane sat alone behind the counter. She looked at the envelope in her apron pocket, the corner of it visible above the fabric. She looked at the tin box. She looked at the door the way she'd looked at it that first morning when she'd pressed her face against the glass from the outside. She picked up her phone. "Melissa, honey, I need to talk." She heard her daughter stop whatever she was doing. The particular stillness of someone who has put everything else down. "I'm here," Melissa said. "Tell me." Patsy had not entirely left. She had gone as far as the doorway, and then for reasons of her own had come back and sat down on the stool nearest the door. She waited until Diane had finished on the phone. Then she said, "There's something I should have told you before." Diane looked at her. "I know why Garrett wants to sell this place." Patsy set her cup down. "Not the business reason, the other reason." She told Diane about the winter of 2008. Garrett's older brother, a man named Roy, had worked at the mill on Route 9. When it closed, Roy had come to Eleanor not for food. He was too proud for that, but for a loan. A small one. Just enough to cover 2 months of bills while he found other work. Eleanor had given him the money. Roy had promised to pay it back by spring. Spring came. Roy had found work by then, but it was less money and the bills hadn't stopped. He went to Eleanor to explain. Eleanor had looked at him and said, "Roy, I didn't write it down. As far as I'm concerned, it was a gift, and I'd appreciate it if you never mentioned it again." She had not written it in her ledger. She had not told anyone. Roy had told Garrett. Years later, when Roy was sick and Garrett was helping him sort through his affairs, Roy had told him about Eleanor and the money and what she'd said. "Garrett came to see me about it," Patsy said quietly. "This was maybe 4 years ago. He said he didn't know what to do with it. He said it made him feel," he used the word small, "that his family had needed charity from a woman who ran a bakery and had never asked for anything back." She looked at her hands. "I told him that's not what it was. He didn't want to hear it." She looked at Diane. "He's been the landlord of this property for 6 years. He could have sold it any time. He didn't until now. I think seeing someone actually come in here and stay, someone who was finding Eleanor in these walls, I think it made it worse for him somehow. Like a reminder of something he'd rather have forgotten." The room was quiet. Diane looked at the tin box on the shelf. She looked at the envelope in her apron pocket. "He's not a bad man," Patsy said. "He's a man who doesn't know what to do with owing something he can never pay back." She stood up, put her jacket on. "What he's doing is still wrong," she added at the door. "I just thought you should understand it." She left. Diane sat alone in the empty bakery. Garrett Hollis wasn't cruel out of greed. He was cruel out of shame. That's the harder kind to forgive. Melissa showed up at the bakery door at 9 that evening, with her laptop bag over her shoulder and no advance notice. Diane opened the door and didn't ask any questions. Melissa came in and set her bag down on the counter. She looked at Diane. "Show me what you found." Diane took the envelope from her apron pocket and laid the letter on the marble. Melissa read it standing up, which was how she read anything important. When she finished, she looked up. "Have you called this law firm?" Not yet, Diane said. Mom! I know. Diane looked at the letter. I'll go in the morning, first thing. Melissa started to say something, then stopped. She looked at her mother, really looked the way she hadn't in a while, and said, Do you want me to come with you? Yes, Diane said. I think I do. They sat in the bakery for a while after that. Melissa made tea from the kettle Diane kept on the back burner. Diane told her about Eleanor the journal, the recipes Patsy and the blueberry pie Clem coming in that first Thursday, and saying not quite but close. Melissa listened without interrupting, which was not something she usually did. When Diane finished, Melissa was quiet for a moment. She sounds like someone who knew exactly who she was, she said. I think she did, Diane said. By the end, anyway. Maybe it took her a while to get there. Then Melissa said, Mom, for what it's worth, I was wrong. About this place, about what you were doing here. Diane looked at her daughter. Melissa was looking at the counter, not at her. I'm not saying it because I have to, Melissa said. I'm saying it because it's true. She picked up her tea. Can I sleep on the cot in the back? Eleanor left it, Diane said. It's yours. Diane walked into Finch and Associates the next morning at 9 o'clock. Melissa was beside her. Diane carried the envelope. She had decided on the walk over that she would say it simply she had found a letter in a bakery she was renting. The letter was addressed to whoever found it, and she wanted to understand what it meant. Daniel Finch was 45 and had his father's filing system. He pulled Eleanor's folder without having to search for it. He read for several minutes without speaking. Then he looked up. Mrs. Price left very clear instructions, he said. He had the careful voice of a man who had learned to say accurate things rather than reassuring things. She wanted the person running this bakery to have the right to continue, not a legal weapon, more like documented intention. My father took this case because he said Mrs. Price was the only client he'd ever had who wasn't protecting something from the past. She was protecting something for the future. He looked at Diane. You're within the time window. You're operating the business. I can write to your landlord, not a threat, just a notification. Let him know what exists before he does something he can't undo. Will it work? Diane asked. I don't know, Daniel said. But it's what Mrs. Price prepared for. I think we should try. Diane looked at the folder on his desk, at Eleanor's name on the tab. Yes, she said. Let's try. The letter went out on a Friday. Garrett called Daniel that same afternoon. The call lasted 40 minutes. Daniel did not discuss the contents with Diane, attorney-client communication, he said, but he told her the conversation had been substantive and that she should expect to hear from Mr. Hollis directly. She heard from him on day 25 of the 30. He came into the bakery on a Tuesday morning before the regular customers arrived. Diane was in the kitchen when the bell above the door made its scraping sound. She came out and found him standing at the counter in his gray sport coat, no envelope in his hand this time. He looked older than he had 2 weeks ago. Not dramatically, just the way people look when they've been carrying something they hadn't expected to carry. Mrs. Hartley, he said. Mr. Hollis. He looked at the counter. He looked at the display case. Then he looked at the tin box on the kitchen shelf, visible through the pass-through window, and he kept his eyes there when he spoke. Your lease, he said. I'll extend it. 12 months, same rate. Diane waited. He was quiet for a moment. His jaw moved slightly the way it does when someone is deciding whether to say the next thing. My brother, he said. Roy. Mrs. Eleanor helped him in 2008 when the mill closed. He told me about it years later after he got sick. He stopped, started again. I didn't handle it well. What she did for him. I didn't know how to. He stopped again. I didn't handle it well. He looked at the tin box for another moment. Then he put his hands in his jacket pockets and turned and walked to the door. Diane said nothing. She didn't need to. The bell made its scraping sound. The door closed. The room was quiet. She stood at the counter for a moment after he left. Then she went back into the kitchen and started the morning's first batch of biscuits. She did not think about Garrett Hollis for the rest of the day. She thought about Roy a little. She thought about Eleanor writing, "I didn't write it down," and what it cost to be that kind of person, and what it gave you. Word traveled. The way it travels in small towns, which is to say, not through any particular channel, but through all of them at once, the way water finds its way through old walls. By Friday, it had reached enough people that Patsy mentioned when she came in for her morning coffee that she'd had 4 different conversations about the bakery at her hardware store in the past 2 days. By Saturday morning, there was a line outside before Diane unlocked the door. She stood at the window and looked at it for a moment before she turned the sign. Clem was at the front with 3 people she didn't know. He raised a hand when he saw her through the glass. Behind him, a woman in her 60s with a canvas bag, a young couple, 2 men in work clothes, who had clearly come before their shift, somewhere a teenager, who was probably there because someone older had brought him, and was surprised to find he didn't mind. The woman with the canvas bag was named Ruth. Diane learned this later. Ruth had grown up 2 streets over and had eaten Eleanor's birthday cakes every year of her childhood. She had brought something wrapped in brown paper, a framed photograph black and white of Price's Bakery, as it had looked in the 1970s. Eleanor behind the counter, young, looking at something off to the left of the camera, her expression caught between concentration and something that was almost a smile. Ruth handed it to Diane across the counter without explanation. Diane looked at it and looked at Ruth and nodded because there wasn't anything to say that would have been adequate. She hung it on the wall behind the register. Melissa had come in early to help. She was behind the counter in the blue apron Diane kept on the hook by the kitchen door, not Eleanor's apron that still hung on its own hook. Her hair pulled back, learning the rhythm of the morning rush, by doing it, asking questions when she needed to, and figuring things out when she didn't. Around 10 o'clock, there was a break in the line, and Diane looked up from the register and saw Melissa wrapping a slice of the almond cake in wax paper, the way Diane had shown her folding the edges, the way the recipe cards were folded carefully, with some attention to the corners. She hadn't shown Melissa that part. Melissa had just noticed how Diane did it, and done it the same way. Diane looked at her daughter for a moment. She thought about Eleanor's last journal entry. "The one who stays will understand." She thought about what it meant to pass something on, not as a transaction, not as an inheritance, but as a continuation. Something that keeps going because someone keeps doing it. She didn't say any of that. She turned back to the register and helped the next customer. At some point in the late morning, she looked up and saw Patsy standing outside on the sidewalk, looking in through the window. Not coming in, just standing there, watching the room the way you watch something you've been waiting to see for a long time. Their eyes met through the glass. Patsy raised one thumb. Then she turned and walked back across the street to her hardware store, and Diane watched her go and understood that this was how Patsy said everything that mattered. 3 months later, Diane Hartley woke up at 5:45 without an alarm. She lay still for a moment in the dark, the way she had every morning for the past several weeks, listening to the particular quiet of a small town before it starts. A car somewhere distant. The first birds. The particular silence that belongs only to the hour before anything is required of anyone. She got up. She made coffee 1 cup without thinking about it, without noticing that she wasn't thinking about it. She drove to the bakery in the dark and let herself in and turned on the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the warmth of it. The oven. the smell of butter that had been in these walls for 50 years and was now gradually becoming the smell of her. The yellow light above the counter, the same fixture that Eleanor had worked under for 5 decades, the same pull chain, the same slight flicker when you first switched it on. She opened Eleanor's journal and set it on the counter. Not to read. She had read most of it by now, some pages many times. She set it there the way you set a photograph on a desk, not to look at constantly, just to have present. Just so the room didn't feel entirely empty of the person who had made it what it was. She started the biscuits. By 6:30, the oven was running, and the first trays were in, and the coffee was made, and she unlocked the front door and flipped the sign and went back to the kitchen to start the bread. This was the hour she loved. Before anyone came. Before the bell above the door made its scraping sound. Just the kitchen and the heat and the work which she had learned over these months was not separate from thinking, but was a kind of thinking, the kind that happens in your hands and your arms and the back of your shoulders when you've done something enough times that your body knows it without being told. Eleanor had known this. She had written it in different ways across 34 years of journal entries. Do the next thing. The ingredients need time to decide. The bread knows what it's supposed to be before you do. Diane had not understood any of that when she first read it. She understood it now. Clem came in at 7:15, same as always, but this morning he had someone with him. A small girl, 8 years old, with his same dark eyes and the particular seriousness of children who are used to spending time with people older than themselves. She stood beside Clem at the display case and looked at everything in it with the focused attention of someone conducting an appraisal. "This is my granddaughter," Clem said. "Lily." "Hi, Lily," Diane said. Lily did not say hi back. She was looking at the almond cake. "Where did you learn to make all this, Fong?" she asked. She said it the way children ask things directly, without the social cushion adults put around questions. Diane thought about it for a moment. "From someone I never met," she said. "But she left behind everything I needed." Lily considered this. She nodded slowly, the nod of someone who has decided this is a satisfactory answer, even if they're not entirely sure what it means. "Can I have that one?" She pointed at the almond cake. "You can." Clem paid. Lily carried the small white bag to the table by the window and sat down and opened it and took one careful bite the way children eat things they've been anticipating. She chewed. She looked at the table. She looked out the window. She took another bite. Then she looked up at Diane and said, "Good." Just that. Diane smiled. She didn't notice herself doing it, didn't feel the effort of it, didn't feel herself deciding to. It just happened the way things happen when they're no longer something you have to make yourself do. Clem caught her eye from across the room and nodded once in the way of someone who has noticed something he's been watching for. At 9 o'clock, Melissa came in. She had called that morning, which was new. She had texted first to say she was coming, which was newer still. She came through the door with a small overnight bag over her shoulder and looked around the room with the easy familiarity of someone who had been here enough times that it had stopped being her mother's place and started being just a place she knew. "Hi," she said. "Hi," Diane said. Melissa set her bag down by the counter. She looked at the display case for a moment, then at the kitchen through the pass-through window. "I took 2 weeks off," she said. "I want to learn how to make the bread. The real way, not just from watching." She paused. "If that's okay." Diane looked at her daughter. She thought about all the things she might say. She thought about the 5 months since October, about the phone calls and the worry in Melissa's voice, and the evening they had sat together under the single light reading Eleanor's papers. She thought about Melissa wrapping the cake slices in wax paper the way she had noticed Diane doing it without being shown. She didn't say any of it. She turned to the hook by the kitchen door, the hook where Eleanor's apron had hung since the day Diane first walked into this bakery, the one she had never touched, never moved, never worn, and she lifted it off the hook and held it out. Melissa looked at the apron. It was old. Faded blue with a white stripe across the pocket, worn thin at the hem, the ties slightly frayed. It looked like something that had absorbed 50 years of heat and flour, and the particular effort of someone who had shown up every day for a very long time. Melissa looked at her mother. Then she took the apron and put it on. Neither of them said anything. Diane went back into the kitchen. She picked up Eleanor's journal from the counter. She had read the last entry so many times that she could have said it from memory, but she read it again. The November 2021 entry. The slow, careful handwriting of a woman who had known she was near the end of something. I've decided to trust. The one who stays will understand. She had read those lines a dozen times. But now below them, she had always stopped. There always assumed that was the end. She saw something she had missed. A final sentence written slightly smaller than the rest, the ink a little different, as if added on a separate occasion. And the one who stays will know when it's time to pass it on. Diane stood very still. She set the journal down on the counter. She looked through the pass-through window into the front room. Melissa was at the counter attempting to use the pastry tongs. She was not getting it quite right, the angle was off, and the slice she was trying to lift was threatening to fall apart. Patsy, who had come in at her usual time with her usual lack of announcement, was standing beside her. She took Melissa's hand gently and adjusted the angle of the tongs, showed her, once, then stepped back and let her try again. Melissa tried again. This time she got it. Patsy said something Diane couldn't hear. Melissa laughed a short, surprised sound, the kind that happens before you decide whether to laugh. Diane watched them through the window for a moment. Then she turned back to the bread dough waiting on the counter. She pressed her hands into it. The dough pushed back the way good dough does, not resistant, just present with its own weight and temperature, and the particular aliveness of something in the middle of becoming what it's supposed to be. She worked it in the quiet kitchen, while the morning came up outside, while the light through the window changed from dark to gray to the particular pale gold of early sun in April in Georgia, and the town outside began its ordinary sounds, and the bell above the door made its scraping sound as the first customers of the day came in. Melissa tied the apron strings wrong the first time right, the second, and walked into the kitchen. B6, closing line and CT a design. The story ends there, but if it stayed with you, if something in Diane's story, or Eleanor's, felt like something you already knew, we'd love to hear from you. Has someone in your life ever left you something you couldn't put into words? Not money, not an object you could hold, something more like a direction, a way of seeing, something you only understood years after they were gone or years after you were ready to receive it. Tell us in the comments. We read every one, and if stories like this one matter to you, subscribe. There are more people like Diane and Eleanor out there, more tin boxes waiting to be opened. We'll keep looking for them. The story ends there. But if it stayed with you, if something in Diane's story or Eleanor's felt like something you already knew, we'd love to hear from you. Has someone in your life ever left you something you couldn't put into words? Not money, not an object you could hold, something more like a direction, a way of seeing, something you only understood years after they were gone or years after you were ready to receive it. Tell us in the comments. We read every one, and if stories like this one matter to you, subscribe. There are more people like Diane and Eleanor out there, More tin boxes waiting to be opened. We'll keep looking for them.